Welcome Galactic Species to the Twilight Imperium 4th Edition tutorial. Twilight Imperium is an epic game of space conquest and politics for 3 to 6 players. To start the game, you're going to need to nominate one player to be the speaker. The speaker is the person who will go first in many parts of the setup and during the first round of gameplay. However, the speaker can change hands during the game, so it's not entirely important who becomes the speaker at the very beginning of the game. After you've decided on a speaker, each player will then need to pick a unique faction. There are 17 to pick from in the game, each with their own unique strengths and weaknesses. After choosing your faction, you're going to need to gather the components specific to your faction. This includes the command and control tokens that have the same faction symbol as the upper right corner of your faction sheets, 2 technology cards that correspond to your faction, a promissory note specific to your faction, the home system tile specific to your faction, which you can differentiate between the other tiles in the game because home system tiles will have greenbacks as opposed to blue or red. And you might as well find the planet cards for the planets in your home system. And lastly, if your faction has any other faction-specific tokens, you'll need to gather them now. Keep in mind though, only 3 factions in the game have these extra tokens. You can always find them because they'll have the symbol matching your faction. After each player has picked a faction and gathered the components specific to those factions, each player is going to need to pick a color. All the colors are exactly the same in terms of gameplay. It's only to help differentiate from each other on the board. After choosing your color, you'll take the corresponding components that match your color, which include a command sheet, 4 promissory notes, technology cards, and of course, the plastic units. Gather all of these components and put them together in your play area. Your promissory notes and technology cards do not need to be shuffled, but you can consolidate your faction cards into their matching decks. Now you're going to need to construct your game board. The tile Mechatol Rex will always be in the center. Then, depending on the number of players, the players will need to set up around the table in the relative location of their home system starting area. The board will vary slightly depending on the number of players, so be sure to look at the reference page in the rules reference book to see what those differences are. However, keep in mind that the footprint of the final game board will be relatively the same size, so be sure you have a big enough play space for this game. I'm going to set this game up for 3 players, and I've placed each of the starting systems in the general location that they'll end up in once the board is complete. And then depending on the number of players, each player will be dealt a number of blue tiles and red tiles. For 3 players, each player will be dealt 6 blue tiles and 2 red ones. Now, starting with the speaker and proceeding clockwise, each player would take their dealt system tiles and place 1 in the innermost uncompleted ring around Mechatol Rex. Which tile they use and where they decide to put it is completely up to the player. Systems known as anomalies, which you can identify with these red markings on the outside of the tile, cannot be placed directly next to each other unless it's otherwise impossible. Additionally, you'll find wormhole tiles, which can similarly not be placed next to each other unless otherwise impossible. But if the wormhole is of a different type, those can be placed next to each other. After each player has placed 1 tile, the placement order will reverse, starting with the last player to have recently placed a tile. And tile placement will reverse again when it heads back to the speaker. In other words, it goes 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1 until all the tiles have been placed, and then each player will connect with their home systems. And here we have a finished board. There is the custodian token, which looks like this, that needs to be placed right on top of Mechatol Rex with the 6th side face up. You're going to then need to shuffle the common decks, which come in the form of agenda cards, action cards, stage 1 objectives, stage 2 objectives, and secret objectives. Each of these decks will need to be shuffled and placed off to the side of the board. There is also a planet deck that doesn't need to be shuffled, but should also be kept close by. You're going to need to create a supply of tokens, which come in the form of fighter tokens, infantry tokens, and trade good tokens. And there are also 8 strategy cards, which should be placed within reach of the speaker and viewing distance of everyone else. On the back of every faction will be their starting technology and starting units. Each player can gather these components, placing the technology in front of themselves face up, and the starting units they can place onto their starting systems. You can tell which models correspond to which units by the pictures depicted on your faction sheet. Structures and infantry should be placed on planets, and a word of advice is to always put your space dock on the planet with the highest resource value. Each planet has 2 numbers on it. A resource value surrounded in yellow and an influence value surrounded in blue. I won't go too in depth in terms of strategy of this game, but I will quickly explain that the number of units you can produce on your turn in a single action is determined by the resource value of the planet your space dock is on. So be sure that space dock is on a planet that is rich in resources. Ships and fighters don't go on planets, but instead go onto the space area of a system. Each player is also going to need to take some of their command tokens and place 3 of them on the tactics space of their command sheet, 3 of them with the ship side face up on the fleet space of the command sheet, and 2 of them on the strategy space of the command sheet. We'll explain what each of these do later, but this is how your command sheet starts. Each player will then be dealt 2 secret objectives and be allowed to keep one of them, returning the other one not chosen back into the secret mission deck to be shuffled. You're going to need to place the victory point tracker somewhere close by on the board, and you can choose if you want to have a 10 victory point limit game or a 14 point limit game. You can end the game early if you achieve the victory point limit first. Place it somewhere off to the side near the board, and each player will take one of their control tokens and placing it on the 0 spot of the victory point tracker. The speaker will then deal 5 face down stage 1 objectives near the board and 5 face down stage 2 objectives below that. And finally, the speaker will reveal the first 2 face down stage 1 objective cards. And with that, you're done with the setup and you're finally ready to play Twilight Imperium. Each round consists of 3 major phases, with the 4th phase being added midway through the game. The phases in order are the strategy phase, the action phase, the status phase, and the 4th phase that gets added is the agenda phase. Again, I won't go too far into detail about the nuance in strategy, but I will teach you how to play. So the first phase is the strategy phase. In this phase, each player, starting with the speaker and proceeding clockwise, will pick one of the 8 strategy cards. Needless to say, each card has a different effect, and a card is broken up into 3 different parts: a primary ability, a secondary ability, and an initiative number. We'll go into more detail about what these abilities do during the action phase, but the initiative number means that once each player has taken one of these cards for themselves, when we move on to the next phase, the action phase, the turn order will actually be determined by ascending order of the strategy cards you possess. So whoever has the lowest initiative number goes first, and then going on to the person with the second lowest number, and so on. And that order will be maintained throughout the entirety of the action phase. Keep in mind though, if you have 3 or 4 players, after each player has gotten a turn to pick one strategy card, you will need to grab another strategy card because of the lesser number of players. Any strategy cards not chosen by the end of the strategy phase will be given 1 trade good to be more enticing in future phases. Whenever you take a strategy card that has trade goods on it, you will also take all the trade goods and put them within your stockpile, located on your command sheet. So that was the strategy phase. Next comes the action phase. During the action phase, you can take 4 types of actions. Strategic actions involve using your strategy card. Tactical actions come from the command tokens that are in your tactical pool of your command sheet. So you can only perform as many tactical actions as you have tokens on your sheet. Once you run out of those, you can no longer perform tactical actions. Certain components in this game will have the word action on them. Using these actions are known as component actions. They can be found on action cards, on your faction sheet, technology cards, or even agenda cards. And the fourth thing you can do in the action phase is pass. However, you cannot pass until you've used all of the strategy cards in your possession. And if you do pass, you are out for the rest of the action phase, meaning whenever it would be your turn again, you get skipped. You can still respond to other players and perform the secondary abilities found on strategy cards, but otherwise, you no longer have a turn in the action phase. It may be the case that you have to pass because you can no longer perform any other type of action, or you could choose to pass early, even though you may still perform actions. It's up to you. Just remember, you have to use all of your strategy cards in your possession before you can pass. So now let's go into a little bit more detail about those kind of actions. As I mentioned, strategy cards have a primary ability and a secondary ability. When you choose to do a strategic action, you perform the primary ability for yourself. The secondary ability does not apply to you. It instead applies to everyone else once you finish performing the primary ability. The secondary ability is usually a lesser form of the primary ability and more expensive, but it allows players who did not take the strategy card still perform something similar to that action. However, it would usually cost them a command token from their strategy pool, so it's up to them to determine how they want to use those tokens effectively. Once you finish performing the primary ability, and each player has either taken or passed on the secondary ability, you then flip it over. It still shows you the initiative number so you don't forget your place in the round order. So that's a strategic action. The next thing you can do is a tactical action, and this is where a majority of your movement, conflict, and production gets pushed all into one action. Your command sheet has a helpful reference guide to show you the steps of a tactical action, but I'll explain them here now. To perform a tactical action, you take one of your command tokens from the tactical pool of your command sheet and place it in a system that you do not already have a command token placed. So the yellow player wants to place their token here. They have now activated this system and may move ships towards it. Each ship in your faction has a movement value, which is the number of systems it may move to get to the system you've activated. There are some restrictions to how movement works in this manner. As an example here, the yellow player has activated this system, meaning they want to move ships into that system potentially. This cruiser has a movement value of 1, and so may move 1 space to move into that system. This cruiser has a movement value of 2, which means that it could have normally gotten to that system. However, you cannot move through systems that have enemy ships. Now I say ships, which means ground troops don't count, and so this cruiser can move in freely. Structures don't count, and fighters don't count. But in this example here, this cruiser cannot move into that system, and it cannot move part of the way to that system. It must end its movement on the activated system, and so cannot move at all. Also, you cannot move ships from a system that have a command token already on it. This system is effectively exhausted, and so nothing more may move out of it. But otherwise, you're allowed to move as many ships as you would like into the system you've activated. However, keep in mind, the fleet spot of your command sheet shows how many ships you're allowed to have in one system at a time. The game starts with you having 3 command tokens in that spot. If at any point you end up having more than what you're allowed by the number of tokens in your fleet pool, you must destroy ships within that system until you no longer exceed your maximum fleet value. What you destroy, though, is up to you. Also, some ships might have capacity values. This is the number of fighters and ground troops it may transport while moving between systems. When moving a ship, you may decide that you want to take some fighters and ground troops with you. These units are not embarked onto any specific ship, but you can instead treat it like this. You can have as many ground troops and fighters in the space part of a system as long as the number of ground troops and fighters does not exceed the capacity value of all the ships within that system. So here, because I have 1 carrier, that has a capacity value of 4, I can have up to 4 fighters and ground troops in the space area of the system without any problem. If I had 2 carriers, it means I could have up to 8, but these fighters and ground troops are not tied to any specific ship, so if one were to for some reason get destroyed, I wouldn't have to lose any of these troops or fighters because they're not considered to be designated on a specific ship. After you finish moving into the activated system, you would ensue space combat if there were any enemy ships also in that system. I'll go into detail on how that works after explaining the rest of the tactical action. The next thing you get to do is invade. Hopefully after being victorious in a space combat, or if there are no enemy space combatants as I have here, you are then allowed to invade the planets in that system with the ground troops you have embarked on your transports. I'll also go into detail about how this works afterwards. But in short, I can take the ground troops that I have in space and finally be able to plop them onto planets, so that I no longer have to worry about carrying them around. If those troops land on planets that already have enemy ground troops, then they would fight and start ground combat. And again, we'll hold off on all the combat stuff later. But if they manage to survive and only your troops remain on a planet, you can then establish control. To do that, you take the corresponding cards of the planets you've now landed from the planet deck and place them within your play area exhausted. Each planet has 2 sides, one full of color and one black and white. The black and white side is the exhausted side. If you for whatever reason decide to leave the planet later and take all ground troops from said planets, in order to remind other players that you are still in control of those planets, place your control tokens on those planets as a reminder, because you control those planets for as long as you are in possession of their cards, which means someone else can take those cards from you if they were to invade the planet. And lastly, as a part of the tactical action, you produce on the system that you activated. In order to produce, you need to have a space dock on one of the planets in the activated system. Here I don't have that in either of these 2 systems. But if I were to activate this system here, my home system, I could choose to produce on it. To produce, I can choose any of the ships here on my faction sheet, which I can pay for, by spending resources equal to their costs. You can produce as many units as you want, as long as the number of units you're purchasing does not exceed the production value of your space dock. Typically, most space docks have this production rule, which says the production value is equal to 2 more than the resource value of the planet that it is on. So here, the planet that this space dock starts on has a resource value of 3, which means that I couldn't buy more than 5 units at a time with 1 production. Over the course of the game, you might acquire trade goods, which can be used as resources, 1 to 1. So 1 trade good is 1 resource that you could use to buy 1 destroyer in this case. Or you can take the planets in your possession and exhaust them to obtain the resources on their card. However, if you exhaust the planet in this way, you're only using it for 1 of the resource values, either its monetary resource or its influential resource. Of course, the monetary value being the only one of use during unit production. Once a planet is exhausted, it can no longer be used for any future purchases until it becomes unexhausted. If the unit you're buying has these 2 symbols next to the cost, it means you're buying 2 at the same time. However, each of those units counts against your production limit. Whenever you produce units, you'll place any ships produced in the space area of the system they're producing from, and any ground troops are placed onto the planet where the space dock is on. There's no limit to how many ground troops can be on a single planet, but remember, the number of units in space is limited by the number of tokens you have in your fleet pool. If you want to produce a unit and you no longer have any of those units available to you in your pool, you can instead choose to remove one of your units of that type from a system on the board that does not contain one of your command tokens and return it to the pool in front of you so that you may then produce it. If you want to produce more fighters and infantry but don't have any remaining in front of you, you can use the fighter and infantry tokens around the board to use as your supplements. However, for the sake of recognition, make sure that these tokens are accompanying one of your models so that the other players know to whom these tokens belong to. Now let's finally start talking about combat. First, I'll mention that combat actually starts at the end of movement if you have a unit with the Space Cannon ability. There are a number of offensive abilities in this game, and you'll see them on the units on your faction sheet. These abilities include Space Cannon, Anti-Fighter Barrage, and Bombardment. And they all work exactly the same way, except they target different units at different times. The way that it works is that the ability will be followed by a number. This is the number you're trying to roll on a d10. So let's say in this example here, the red player just moved into this system. Once he's finished moving, you can see here on the tactical action reference card that after you move ships, you do the Space Cannon offensive. Because the yellow player here has a unit with the Space Cannon ability, it activates. He takes 1d10 and is trying to roll equal to or greater than the number on that ability, which in this example is 6. If he's successful, he scores a hit. If he's not successful, nothing happens. If there is a second number next to the first number, this is actually the number of dice you're throwing. So for example, if the ability read Space Cannon 6 times 2, it means you're rolling 2d10s and each 6 or greater scores a hit. That is how all the offensive abilities work. Then combat starts if the system still has 2 opposing players' ships. The first thing that happens is the Anti-Fighter Barrage. If a unit has that ability, they get to use it now, in the same way that I mentioned before, except this ability only affects fighters. Step 2 is that you announce retreats. However, retreating doesn't actually occur until the very end of a combat round. And if you do choose to retreat, keep in mind that when you do, you retreat with all of your ships in that system. And you could choose to take any ground units on the planets that you control up into your ships at this time, so that they can hopefully retreat later. Step 3 is to make combat rolls. You roll 1 dice for each ship you're going to attack with, and you're looking to score the combat value of that ship or greater. These rolls happen simultaneously, so the red player and the yellow player will be doing this at the same time. If your ship has these icons next to the combat value, that is actually the number of dice you'll be rolling. So each player simply designates which ship they're going to shoot with, roll the dice, and if it scores a hit, they'll keep it to the side. So here, by the end of the combat rolls, the yellow player has scored 3 hits and the red player has scored 2 hits. Step 4, the players will have to assign those hits onto their own ships. Each ship only has 1 health, so after you assign it 1 damage, it is destroyed. So the yellow player can choose to have their 2 fighters die, while the red player has to choose between the ships that they control. Step 5 of space combat is to retreat. If you're retreating, you have to take all of your ships and move them into an adjacent system that doesn't have any enemy ships, and it must contain either a planet you control or one of your own units. Otherwise, you are not allowed to retreat. So here the yellow player does retreat back into his own system, even though he was winning the combat, because he declared a retreat previously. And lastly, if you do retreat and the system you retreat to doesn't have one of your own command tokens on it, you will then place one of your command tokens there. But if you don't retreat and you still have some remaining ships, then you would go on to another round of space combat. And this continues until one side is either wiped out completely or one side retreats. It is possible that both sides can be completely destroyed during space combat. And then starts the invasion step of the tactical action, which starts with bombardment, which is another offensive action. Same as before. Then the invading player may commit any ground forces they have in space onto any planets of the system they're invading, and can spread them out however they wish. The third step in an invasion is a space cannon defense. Same as before, except this can only target the ground troops landing on your planet. And then ground combat, which works exactly the same as space combat, where players will roll dice and assign hits, except there is no retreating in ground combat. Once units are locked in a fight, they are there until one side is completely wiped out or everyone is dead. And lastly, if the invading player is successful and there are no longer any enemy troops on the planet, they will establish control by taking the planet card from the previous owner and placing it in their play area exhausted. and if there are any remaining structures that belong to the enemy player, they are immediately destroyed. And that wraps up the entirety of how tactical actions work. But before we move on to the status phase, let me talk about a few things that can happen during the action phase. First off, the action cards that you will acquire over the course of a game have very specific rules on when they can be used. Before certain things happen, as a component action, after certain phases, and so on. You can use as many of these as you want so long as you fulfill their timing requirements. However, you cannot have more than 7 in your hand at one time. Once you acquire more than 7, you must discard down until you are no longer exceeding 7. And after you've used an action card, you discard it. The next thing we'll talk about is trading. Trading is a completely social aspect of this game. Over the course of the game, you might acquire commodities, which are represented by this gray token on the reverse side of the trade goods yellow token. You might obtain this during the primary ability of the trade strategic card, and these commodities actually go on the faction sheet, and it cannot exceed the limit as designated by your faction sheet. These commodities represent goods that your faction creates in excess and does not see as valuable, so they're worthless to you, but they are not worthless to other players. If you are neighboring another player, i.e. you have ships or controlled planets next to a system that has another player's planets or ships, you are considered neighbors and may engage in trades and deals. During your turn, you may negotiate trades and deals with each other player around the table. However, you cannot complete more than one trade between each player. So here, if it was the red player's turn, they could do one trade with the blue player and one trade with the yellow player, and no more. If you trade commodities to another player, once it goes into the other player's possession, you will flip it to become a trade good that will then go into the trade good spot of your command sheet and can then be used as a resource for future purchases. These trade goods can represent monetary resource or influential resource. How you use it is up to you, but once you use it, it's gone. Each player is also in possession of 5 promissory notes, one unique to their faction. These may also be traded between players. However, you may only trade one at a time. These promissory notes include special abilities that the player who possesses them may use at any point where applicable. And you may trade away promissory notes given to you by other players. So for example here, the red player could trade his ceasefire promissory note to the blue player, and later the blue player may trade that same promissory note to the yellow player. You of course cannot activate your own promissory notes, and once you use a promissory note, it is returned back to its original owner. And because these trades and deals are completely social, there are only a few rules to keep it from getting out of hand. If you're working out a trade with another player, and that trade is something that you can immediately fulfill, that is known as a binding deal, and you must fulfill it. For example, if it's the red player's turn, and they turn to the blue player and say, if you give me all of your commodities and all of your resources, I will not move into your system this turn. If the blue player accepts, the red player must fulfill that deal. This is so that you can't outright lie to other players and go back on your word after making a deal like that. However, if you and another player work out a deal that does not have to be immediately fulfilled, for example, if the red player asks the blue player not to move into a certain system so that it can be available for them later on, they can agree on the trade, but because the details of the deal cannot be immediately fulfilled and instead pertain to an event that happens later, the blue player doesn't have to fulfill that deal because it's non-binding, and may at a later turn decide that they want to move into that planet anyways. How this affects the real relationship between people at your table will vary depending on your group, but it is worth noting the distinction between binding deals, which can happen immediately, and non-binding deals, which do not need to be upheld. So now we move on to the status phase. The first step of the status phase is to score objectives. There are 10 objectives here that will be revealed over the course of the game. If any player can fulfill those requirements during the status phase, they're allowed to place one of their control tokens on the objective they're fulfilling and move their victory point tracker up the corresponding number of spaces according to the objective they fulfilled. However, marking an objective in this way means that you cannot complete the same objective more than once, but other players may still complete that objective. However, you cannot score more than one public objective during a single status phase, but you may score a public objective and a secret objective that occurred during the status phase. As you can see here, these objectives have status phase at the top. Some might have action phase. So during a single status phase, you're only allowed to complete one public and one secret. It is also worth noting that you cannot have more than 3 completed and uncompleted secret objectives in your possession. The second step of the status phase is to reveal the next public objective. Public objectives are revealed from left to right if you set them up as I have done here. All Stage 1 objectives must first be revealed before you can start revealing Stage 2 objectives. It is also important to note that you cannot score any public objectives if you do not control all the planets in your own home system. If you've arrived at the reveal public objective step of the status phase and there are no more public objectives to reveal, the game immediately ends and whoever has the most victory points is declared the winner. If there's a tie, the player with the earliest initiative order would then win. But if that is not the case, then you move on to step 3 of the status phase, where each player would draw an action card. Step 4 would be to remove any command tokens that are on the board, returning them to your stockpile. Step 5 would be to gain and redistribute tokens. During this step, you gain 2 command tokens that you may place in any of the pools on your command sheet, and you may also rearrange any tokens that are already there. Step 6 is to ready all the cards in your possession, so that any exhausted cards you possess become unexhausted. Step 7 is to repair units. Some units might have an ability called Sustain Damage. If this is the case, when they take a hit, they aren't immediately destroyed, and instead they're flipped upside down. If they were to take another hit, then they are destroyed. But if they survive until this part of the phase and are still flipped upside down, you would then flip it right side up. And step 8 would be to return the strategy cards back to the collective pool. And after that, you're ready to start a new round, starting again with the strategy phase, where the speaker will be the first to pick from the strategy cards and proceeding clockwise. Now I mentioned that there is a 4th phase. This is known as the agenda phase, but this phase is not introduced into the game until a player successfully invades Mechatol Rex. But in order to do so, they must also spend 6 influence points. If they're able to do that between the trade goods they have or the planetary cards they control, then they will take the custodian token, gain 1 victory point, and place this in front of them. They move up on the victory track, and now the agenda phase is permanently added after the status phase until the game ends. The agenda phase itself is very simple. The speaker will draw the first agenda card on top of the deck and call a vote. Each player will vote with the planets that they control by exhausting them to spend their influence. Each influence counts as 1 vote. You can choose to abstain, but if you don't, you follow the instructions on each agenda card. They might ask you to vote for or against, or to elect a specific player, or to elect a specific planet. Players will cast their vote using their planet's influence, but the players are also allowed to conduct trades, as I mentioned before, even though they might not be considered neighbors. It's because you are all sitting around a galactic council, and that is why you are able to conduct trades and negotiations. After voting, you resolve the agenda you voted for. Some are laws, such as this card, which stay in effect until otherwise stated. Some are directives, which offer a one-time bonus. You resolve them and then discard them. After resolving the first agenda, the speaker will then draw a second agenda, and you will resolve that. Keeping in mind now each player has less resources than they did in the first vote, because they might have spent it. So it becomes part of the strategy to take into account that there will be 2 votes during the agenda phase. After both agenda cards have been resolved, each player will take all of their exhausted planets and ready them back up again, so that they're available for the next round. And that's most everything you need to know in order to play this game. But I will go over one more thing, and that is the technology cards. You have a deck of 25 technology cards that range from buffs to upgrades to the ships you control on your faction sheet. Over the course of the game, specifically during the technology strategic action, you may be allowed to acquire a technology card. And you can acquire any technology card in your technology deck, so as long as you meet the prerequisites. In the bottom left-hand corner of a technology card is the prerequisites for that technology. This gravity drive card says you must have one blue token already in your possession before you're allowed to acquire this technology. This means that the player will have to have this anti-mass deflector first, because this does not have a prerequisite and counts as a blue token once acquired. However, it may also be the case that you are in possession of a planet that also has that blue token. If this is the case, when it comes time to acquire a technology, you may instead exhaust a planet that has that same symbol to count as that symbol for your prerequisites. If you acquire a ship, you'll place it on top of its corresponding spot on your faction sheet, and it then takes the place of its predecessor. And every ship you have currently on the board will now have the new stats of the newly acquired technology. Keep in mind though, these ship upgrades do not count as any symbol, so they do not help in the acquisition of future technologies. Planets will also have these other symbols beside the name. These only apply to special cards which specifically refer to them, and they are otherwise unimportant. These are known as planet traits. Red is a hazardous planet, green is an industrial planet, and blue is a cultural planet. But that's it. That's how you play Twilight Imperium. While the game rules aren't that complicated, the time it takes to go through all the steps of a single game can take hours. And that's why this game has the infamous playtime of an entire day, depending on the number of players. It's now up to you to figure out your own strategy and how do you want to achieve victory. But that's really up to what objective cards you might draw or are publicly available. So the strategy changes with every game. Not to mention each faction has their own strengths and weaknesses, and there are 17 to choose from for a lot of variety. The only rules that I didn't mention are the effects of different anomalies, which can be found on the reference portion of your command sheet, as well as the specific abilities of all the strategic cards. But I'll let you figure those out for yourself and your gaming group. If you enjoyed this tutorial, give it a like and consider subscribing so that you can help me make future videos. If you have any specific questions, leave them in the comment section below so that I or another person may answer them. But otherwise, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and you'll see me in the next video. So let's keep on rolling.